Hello and welcome to Biblical Justice A to X. If you're joining us in the live audience, please be sure to close your other computer programs for the best audiovisual experience. Hello, my name is Sosamma Samuel-Burnett, and I serve as founder and president of Global Justice, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator for Biblical Justice A to X. This monthly video conference is presented to you by Global Justice to give us opportunities to discuss a wide range of biblical justice concerns, from abortion to xenophobia. This month, we're focusing on the very important topic of gender. And we're particularly pleased to have our expert panelist with us, Dr. Mimi Hadad, president of CBE International. Welcome, Mimi.
Thank you very much.
Well, before we get started on this set of questions and our forum discussion, I wanted to take a moment to introduce Dr. Hadad and then have a chance for her to share about CBE International. So let me start with her wonderful biograph. Dr. Mimi Hadad is president of CBE International, but she is also part of the leadership of Evangelicals for Justice. She's a founding member and leader of the Evangelicals and Gender Study Group at the Evangelical Theological Society. She was a convener of the Issue Group 24 for the 2004 Lausanne Third Committee for World Evangelization. Dr. Hadad is also an adjunct assistant professor of historical theology at Fuller Theological Seminary and Olivet University. In addition, Dr. Hadad has taught for colleges and seminaries around the world. She currently serves as a gender consultant for World Vision International and Beyond Borders. She was recently interviewed by Mark Leverton, president of the Fuller Theological Seminary, and in addition, she has been an award-winning author. She's written in more than 100 academic and popular articles and blogs, including Is Gender Equality a Biblical Ideal? Dr. Hadad holds a graduate degree from the University of Colorado and Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a PhD in historical theology from the University of Durham, England. In addition, Palmer Theological Seminary of Eastern University awarded Mimi an honorary doctorate of divinity in 2013. Again, welcome, Dr. Mimi Hadad.
Thank you.
Mimi, would you share with us a little bit about CBE International and the leadership that you provide there?
Sure. Women's for Biblical Equality is an international, interdenominational organization. Our members live on every continent, and they represent over 100 different denominations. So we're a very, very broad tent organization. We stand together on one platform that the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, teaches the fundamental equality, agency, and voice of men and women, created in God's image and recreated into the image of Christ. And so our work is academic, it's popular, it's justice-oriented. Our members constitute, I would say, one of the most significant and broadest evangelical voice on gender and justice. We hold events, we do practical projects, we partner with like-minded organizations around the world, addressing the issue of faith and gender in many different contexts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So let's get started with our conversation. I think it's important that before we get into this topic, we kind of frame the topic. And so for our audience, give us a sense of, the facts and figures. What do we need to know about this topic of gender to be able to get into our deeper discussion?
Yeah, it is very important for us to realize, though you rarely hear it taught or preached from pulpits around the world, that there are 200 million females missing from the planet. This is the largest gender holocaust in the world, in human history. This data was compiled by Dr. Amartya Sen. He received a Nobel Prize in economics, and he developed a lens for gender economics. He is simply a very, very aggressive statistician. And especially in the global south, we noticed that girls and women were missing. And that when he first began his research in around 1995, less than 100 million girls were missing, but that number has doubled. Wow. It has been particularly challenging in communities where there is a deep philosophical view that women are inferior to men, and these views are always sustained in faith communities. And that's where we do our work.
Well, and let's pick up on there, when we talk about this idea of 200 million women missing, and missing means what? Are they individuals that have been lost to things like human trafficking? Are they individuals that are not counted in things like the censuses in the area or not having status? Would you clarify that a little?
Yeah, happily. These girls and women have been trafficked. Their whereabouts is currently unknown, or they have been aborted before birth or killed immediately after birth, solely for one reason, their gender. And not just because of their gender, but also the value we associate with gender. Families pay high dowry prices for the birth of a girl. They recognize the financial cost of giving birth to girls and raising them, and this has placed unusual burdens in cultures where girls are very costly.
Right, and it's very sad. I mean, horrible statistic to share. I want to sort of delve into sort of more of the biblical perspective on this. You know, we understand justice from a biblical perspective, so tell us about this concept of gender from a biblical perspective.
Well, Christians for Biblical Equality has from its beginning taught that the Bible is very consistently clear that what theologians call the ontological or the inherent value of human beings has nothing to do with their skin color, their gender, their socioeconomic status, that by virtue of being created human in God's image, we believe that you have the potential, all human beings have the potential for leadership if your moral character is intact and you're walking with God and you're living a holy life. God gives gifts to all of us, really regardless of our gender, our socioeconomic class, or our ethnicity. And this is certainly the story of Scripture. From Genesis into Revelation, it's very difficult to find one woman who is truly submissive to the men in her life. Mm-hmm. And I remember growing up in the evangelical world, hearing that women are to be submissive to men, and sadly that places girls and women at risk.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, do you also think that sometimes some of the passages that they refer to, you know, are misinterpreted passages of the Bible when we talk about the submission passage, for example? Could you expand on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. Well, so many theologians have pointed out, and I've tried to in my writings, that there are about 3 passages primarily that are used to marginalize and exclude the voice and agency and shared authority of women. 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy 2, and Ephesians 5, all the writings of Paul. These are eddies off the stream of Paul's theological thought, and certainly the example of Christ and Paul. Mm-hmm. So if you carefully track what Paul and Jesus actually did beside women, build churches in Ephesus, in Corinth. The very first church in Europe was founded by a team of people, but especially Lydia in the town of Philippi. So, I mean, the sociological and historical data that we uncover every year shows that the early church did in fact share authority with women. It wasn't until the church became sort of accepted after the rise of Constantine to the throne that the men sort of scampered to the top and pressed women out, and they used a Platonic dualism in doing so, arguing that women are inferior to men and citing texts like 1 Timothy 2 in its defense.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that makes a lot of sense, you know, that it was much more of a historical construct versus something that the Bible was advocating. And of course, Jesus is a great example for us, right? You know, he was very good to women and put women into positions that they would otherwise not be able to have in that context. So thank you for sharing that. And I want to expand out a little bit from that conversation, talk about this issue of gender as a justice concern. Certainly, you know, we have many women in the world, and certainly there are many injustices in the world. But why is it that we should be concerned particularly about women when we're talking about justice?
Well, because women have suffered the grossest injustice since the fall. Genesis, our holy text, teaches that when Adam and Eve betrayed their relationship with God, one another, and self, one of the first consequences was Adam's rule over Eve. Mm-hmm. And that led to just a tragic marginalization and abuse of girls and women globally throughout history. And one of the the great signs of Christ's presence in our midst is a redeeming of human dignity and agency, particularly girls and women. Wherever the gospel has gone, almost consistently we have seen a rise in the dignity of girls and women. Occasionally the church backpedals on this agenda, but for example, the modern missionary movement, what we call the golden age of missions from about the middle to the late 1800s, when women and slaves rushed to the mission field in great numbers, outnumbering men 2 to 1, they believed that Christ's return to earth was imminent, and it was all hands on deck. And the church was shocked to see how successful women and slaves really were. And this led to an examination of those texts that supposedly hold women in subjection to men. Women were leading mission efforts around the world, and they were wildly successful. And they had a deep concern for the humanitarian objectives of the gospel, and those objectives are often lost when women's voices are missing.
And along those same lines, it seems that as we're pursuing gender equality and an opportunity for women to really flourish in society, you sometimes also hear about other types of gender-related topics, and whether it's same-sex issues, other issues. How does CBE address that type of concern, and how do you focus your work on the status of women?
Well, our primary objective from God, we believe, is to dismantle patriarchy as a theological ideal. And so we really don't get into human sexuality at all. We're far too busy working on a biblical agenda for girls and women. And largely because, the challenge has been so severe.
And so daunting. It seems like such a large task to take on. I also want to expand a little bit and talk about the global perspective. You've mentioned several global examples, but let's talk about the status of women internationally. Tell us a little bit about the framework for that and what we should know.
Well, really the best place to understand that is UN Commission on Women. They track very carefully, just really rapidly, and day by day, month by month, the status of women. So I refer you to their website. The kind of work that we do is to partner with like-minded believers in different communities to address things like dowry price, bride price, burial rights. We work very closely with the East African Kenyan public school system to implement a curriculum. Our goal is to keep girls and women in school through high school, so that they defer early marriages. We find that this is the best chance that they have to have a voice in their communities. We've been doing pretty extensive Bible studies with local churches to help them see a fuller message on the potential for women's leadership, and it's had a significant impact. It's important to realize that and businesses have known this for many, many years, that when you put women at the tables of decision making at the highest level, at the middle levels, and at the lower levels, productivity rises and unethical practices decrease. So businesses are very careful to ensure that women have a voice in decision making. Before the fall in Genesis, we know that God created men and women in God's image and gave them governance together over the created world. Adam did not govern woman. He ruled over her after sin entered the world, but the ideal picture before sin entered the world was that men and women shared leadership. And I think that plays out in very real and practical and ethical ways. Even today. We were intended to work together.
That's great, and I think that's also shown in some of the information you shared about the UN Millennium Project and how women's voices and women's involvement can make a big difference on issues such as poverty. Would you share a little bit about that and kind of the status of women in that context?
Yeah, I was actually there when the Millennium Project launched at the UN in New York, and it was very fascinating to me to watch the humanitarian world place women in positions of leadership way ahead of the church. And it reminded me of something Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, justice, sadly, are taillights for the church rather than the headlights of the church. And that has certainly played out in the plight of women and gender equality. But I think things are really changing very quickly. The Millennium Project has just relaunched its goals about 3 months ago. You can read about that on the website. And again, gender equality is woven into all of their long-term goals because you cannot leverage humanitarian work without the leadership of women. And I believe the same is true for the gospel. We cannot successfully complete the mission of the church without the leadership of women. And that is why I go to work every day.
That's good, and we're glad you do that. I'll also highlight the fact that the Millennium Project, which is focusing particularly on poverty issues, that 70% of women, 70% of the world's population in poverty are women, and that number could even expand as high as 80% when you also think about the children and the elderly that they care for. So it's a pretty staggering number. So it's not just that women are significant; they're the disproportionate ones affected by these issues. I also want to take a few moments to take on a couple of topics that are very gender-specific topics, things like wage equality. That's a topic that has gotten a lot of attention in a lot of circles. I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about that and what we need to be concerned about on that topic.
Well, sadly, in the secular world, in the U.S., of course, we're quite familiar with data that women are not earning dollar for dollar the same as men for the same work. In the Christian world, it gets even worse. If you consider higher education, women are doing about half as well as women in secular, the secular academy. And so I think the whole idea that women should not be in leadership plays out very much in the Christian world. Now we know that, as you said, there are humanitarian consequences to theological ideas. Plato said, ideas have consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And theological ideas have significant consequences. So wherever humanitarians are working successfully to advance humanitarian endeavors, the church is somehow slowly catching up, but we are significantly behind. Now, this wasn't so much the case during the golden era of missions, because the world really, the church just sort of threw its hands up in the air and said, Christ will be here any minute. It's all hands on deck. And women dashed off to take on not just evangelistic endeavors, but also humanitarian ones, because for this community of Christians, that was the same project. Evangelizing and social action were the same project. Mm-hmm. That has split apart in our evangelical community today for lots of interesting reasons. But
mm-hmm. And just to follow on from that, we also have this recent set of elections, and the political sphere is a very significant one for women. Would you talk a little bit about that, and where do you see women today in terms of political capacity, political clout, political status?
Well, we have as a country always lagged behind places like Scandinavia and Europe and even India, and so we haven't achieved our fullest potential as a country in advancing gender equality. My personal view is the United States is a very patriarchal country. We're a very violent country. I don't know that we have actually examined ourselves critically in these areas, but I think this election has made, this administration has made it a little clearer the kind of values we do hold. And I'm not really a competent political analyst, but I can tell you that I do know something about American patriarchy and the climate that we live in this country. It is very patriarchal, and it's very violent. And we see that in the data that comes across through our police communities and the tracking that we do. We need to do better tracking on the abuse of girls and women, but about 1 in 4 females in our country will experience violence or sexual abuse of some sort, and that data is not so different if you belong to a church. And it really should be. And that's the project we're tackling. CBE is working on some really crucial curriculum to help seminary faculty train pastors on domestic violence and abuse. Mm-hmm. But that is a consequence of an idea. We need to self-examine our patriarchal positioning relative to our identity as Americans and American evangelicals.
Now, do you also think that part of the challenge for women is sort of the biological status? You know, the fact that, you know, in some cases we may be physically smaller than men, that might be making it more difficult in a domestic abuse situation. For example, there's, you know, pregnancy. There's a lot of different aspects of the, you know, sort of the physiology of women that make it more challenging. Do you think that is part of why women have the more challenging role, or do you think it's much broader than that?
You know, I think that has always played a role in domestic violence and abuse, that women just are not as strong as men, although in some cases that's not the case, true.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more of a mental perspective. For example, CBE published a book about, probably about 18 years ago, where we did a survey of pastors and women in churches and asked questions about, you know, does your pastor preach on abuse? Does your pastor do premarital counseling on abuse and violence? And have you personally experienced domestic violence or abuse? And the nomenclature, what constitutes a violent action? What constitutes having suffered abuse? These were conversations that women had not really thought about critically. Lots of women had been abused verbally, psychologically, physically, but a slap in the face, well, that's not really abuse, or being shoved up against the wall, that's not. Is that abuse? So we don't really even help women understand, yes, indeed, being shoved up against a wall is an abuse act.
And there's a similar argument for even, you know, the rape culture that we're seeing, particularly in the college campuses and that type of thing. I also want to take a moment to talk about the girl child. You know, you've referenced the girl child in a couple of different contexts, but let's expand on that. You know, I think among women, the girl child has a particularly significant set of concerns. And so would you share a little bit about that, both nationally and globally?
Sure. From where we work, a girl child, there are, you know, I think the book, The Color Purple, said it so well. It ain't safe in this world for a girl child. And I love that expression, because the communities around the world, and in the United States also, preys upon girls and the girl child. So we have found that when we invest in the lives of girls, when we provide them with resources for education, for health, for self-determination, for vocational training, things really begin to change in their communities. And we place a lot of effort and focus on investing in the lives of girls. We call that the girl effect. Study after study shows that when you can turn around this preying upon girls, which is a global problem, that rather than preying on them, protecting them, keeping them in school, providing them with sanitary napkins so they don't miss school during their period, ensuring that when they come home from school, they're not off cooking dinner and caring for the flock or the fields while their brothers are in their Simba studying for their classes the next day. But these girls have equal opportunity in the evening at home, and the work around the home is shared between brother and sister, husband and wife, so women are not kept in poverty the rest of their lives and worse, dependent upon abusive family life, family members.
Thank you for that. And I just want to do one more follow-up question, which is, you know, you referred to the fact that, you know, when you talk about, you know, gender inequalities, it doesn't really matter in some senses whether it's a Christian community or a non-Christian community, but we also know that particular faith traditions also have particular perspectives about women. And so when you think about certain faith traditions, for example, you know, we're talking about, you know, Islam, if we're talking about other types of faith traditions, how do we address that concern when it might be not just a you know, societal thing, but it's deeply cultural, deeply personal within families? Comments on that?
Well, I have worked with feminists from varied faith communities, and we all tackle similar circumstances. How to interpret our sacred text consistently and with an eye to elevating the dignity of girls and women. How do we retain the contributions women have made throughout our faith traditions? And how do we move forward in giving girls and women equal opportunity in leveraging the best we have for our community. I mean, even if you have a thoroughly egalitarian community, sometimes people don't rise to their ideals. Other times we have communities that really believe girls and women should be under the authority of men, but these are communities that rise above those ideas. And so people are complex and communities are complex.
Absolutely. And, you know, maybe a stark example of that is FGM, you know, female genital mutilation, that, you know, that is something where people can, despite particular practices or faith perspectives, can actually rise beyond that to address the health and other concerns for the women and children affected by that. Well, we only have a few minutes left in our broadcast time, and I want to take a moment to allow you to share a little bit about what your latest projects are and what you're doing at CBE that our audience should know about. So would you share a little about that as well?
Well, we're meeting this weekend in Orlando, Florida for an international conference. I hope you can join us. We have lots of scholarships available for students and low-income individuals. We have a student paper competition where students from all over the world have competed for a place to read their papers. We're very happy that some of our winners come from Mexico and from varied places in the world. We're also excited about our next conference, which will be in Finland next year in Helsinki, August 3 through 4. We're working on some important book projects, including some Bible translation endeavors. Sadly, often Scripture has not been translated well on texts that deal with gender, and so we're kind of tackling that project. And we're thrilled to see a number of seminaries and colleges join hands with CBE and launching chapters and projects in their communities to be sure that girls and women have all the opportunities they need to become all that God has called them to do. So it's an exciting time. Lots of foundation money is out there working to join hands with these types of projects. We're looking at one project is a meta-analysis of domestic violence and abuse. Sometimes it's hard to gather all of the data that you would want, but there are these smaller studies that have the exact data that you need, and you can kind of compile it to construct a real good idea of what's happening out there for girls and women. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. You know, you and CBE International have been working so diligently on this topic for so long, and I do hope many in our audience will consider being part of the CBE International Conference in Orlando. You can find more information at their website at cbeinternational.org. And I want to thank you, Dr. Mimi Hadad, for serving as our expert panelist and talking with us today about this very significant topic of gender and gender equality. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today for Biblical Justice A to X Gender. I invite you to join us on our website shortly when we will share the same session in a recorded fashion that you can share with other friends and associates. In addition, we'll be sharing with you our video guide. The video guide provides additional questions for you to study in small groups as well as resources for you to reference. Thank you again for joining us today for Biblical Justice A to X. We hope you'll join us again next month for our next topic. God bless you.